Not tonight.
This happened about 8 months ago, and I'm only now able to talk about it without my hands shaking. My marriage didn't end with screaming or broken dishes or dramatic confrontations in parking lots. It ended with paperwork, silence, and the kind of methodical precision you'd expect from someone who spent 30 years learning how to build structures that don't collapse under pressure. I'm Jessica, 33, and I used to work in corporate finance at a regional investment firm downtown. The used to part of that sentence is important, but we'll get there. I was married to Benjamin for nearly 10 years. He worked in construction management and infrastructure development, the kind of guy who could look at a blueprint and see the finished building in his mind. He'd worked on military subcontractor projects early in his career, managed development contracts worth millions, built everything from office complexes to residential communities. He was quiet, methodical, almost boring in how carefully he approached everything. I used to joke with my friends that living with him was like being married to a very polite engineer who occasionally remembered to ask how my day went. His idea of excitement was reorganizing the garage or updating our household spreadsheets. I found it insufferably dull. I thought his quietness meant he was passive, maybe even weak. That miscalculation destroyed my entire life. Things started unraveling around January. I reconnected with Adrian at this corporate wellness leadership summit in Palm Springs. It was one of those conference things my company sent me to. All team-building exercises and networking sessions by the pool. Adrian was my ex from college, someone I dated seriously for about 2 years before we graduated and went our separate ways. Seeing him again after so long with that easy confidence and the way he actually seemed interested in what I had to say, it felt like waking up after years of sleepwalking. We had drinks that first night at the hotel bar, reminisced about old times, laughed about professors we'd hated. By the second night, we'd progressed to his hotel room, then mine. I told myself it wasn't serious, just some harmless fun. A break from the monotony of silent dinners with Benjamin and his endless talk about load-bearing calculations. The affair continued for about 4 months after that conference. Adrian worked as a senior consultant for a tech solutions firm that occasionally did vendor work with my company, which should have raised red flags, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I'd rented this apartment in the city, a beautiful place in a luxury building called the Vireo. All marble foyers and floor-to-ceiling windows. I told Benjamin I needed it for those nights when I worked late and didn't want to deal with the commute home. He just nodded, asked if I needed help setting it up, offered to handle the lease paperwork. I thought he was being supportive. Looking back, I realized he was collecting information, watching, waiting. I was too distracted to notice that he'd stopped asking questions about my late nights, stopped seeming bothered by my increasingly frequent girls' nights out with friends, stopped reacting to anything I did. I thought he'd checked out of the marriage. He hadn't. He'd just started building something I couldn't see yet. The whole thing crashed in late March. We just finished another awkward dinner, cold chicken and colder silence. The kind of meal where you realize you've become strangers sharing a kitchen. Benjamin asked if I wanted to go out for a drink, maybe catch a movie, anything to break the tension. I shrugged, barely looking up from my phone where I was texting Adrian. Then I said it. I looked Benjamin straight in the face and said something like, "Not tonight. Adrian actually remembers what I like. He pays attention." The words came out casual, almost bored, like I was commenting on the weather. I wanted a reaction, some sign that Benjamin still cared enough to fight for us. What I got was something much worse. Benjamin went completely still, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. He didn't yell, didn't demand explanations, didn't throw anything. He just stared at me with this strange expression, like he was looking at a complete stranger who'd walked into his kitchen and started rearranging his life. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then he stood up, walked down the hallway to our bedroom, and pulled this old leather duffel bag from the back of the closet, one he hadn't used in years. He packed exactly enough clothes to make it clear he wasn't running away. He was walking out, clean, sharp, unapologetic. I followed him down the hall, arms crossed, smirking, because part of me thought this was some kind of dramatic gesture that would end with him apologizing in a few days. Then, I watched him open the safe behind the bookshelf, the one I'd never bothered learning the combination to, because I figured financial stuff was his territory, and I had better things to do. He pulled out a black fireproof folder, thick and clearly important. When I asked what it was, he zipped his bag closed and said, "Not tonight," echoing my own words back to me. Then he left. No slamming doors, no dramatic speeches, just gone. I genuinely believed he'd come back within a week, tail between legs, ready to grovel. That's how these things work, right? The betrayed spouse throws a fit, disappears for a few days to make a point, then comes back when reality sets in. But Benjamin didn't call that night, or the next morning, or the day after that. Complete radio silence. No angry texts demanding to know how long the affair had been going on. No weepy voicemails, nothing. It was like he'd vanished completely. I poured myself wine and told myself he was being melodramatic, probably sulking in some cheap motel, eating takeout and missing me already. My friend Monica came over the next evening with a bottle of red wine, trying to comfort me, but she seemed nervous in a way that didn't make sense. Monica had known Benjamin for years, had watched us build our life together, and she kept saying these weird things that should have warned me. Stuff like, "Jessica, you don't understand the kind of man Benjamin is. He doesn't build things randomly. He plans everything 3 steps ahead. Remember that patio he built in my backyard? He showed up with a complete blueprint, didn't say much, just worked methodically. And when he was done, it was solid as hell. Perfect, permanent. Benjamin doesn't argue. He builds. And when he builds revenge, you don't see it until it's already concrete." I waved her off, poured another glass of wine, and laughed about how he was probably scrolling through apartment listings and feeling sorry for himself. Monica didn't laugh. She just looked at me with this expression I couldn't read at the time, shook her head, and left earlier than usual. I should have listened to her. About 5 days after Benjamin walked out, things started happening. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. I got an email at work from our compliance department, one of those formal messages with urgent in the subject line and red receipt requested. They wanted me to come in for a meeting regarding discrepancies in my travel expense reports from the Palm Springs conference. Specifically, they had questions about my hotel room and why there appeared to be a second guest registered under a vendor contact's name. My stomach dropped. Adrian worked for a vendor firm. We'd shared a hotel room that weekend, booked under what we thought was discrete confirmation numbers. I'd been careless, hadn't considered how detailed those corporate invoices would be. The compliance meeting was brutal. I walked in expecting a simple clarification, maybe some paperwork mix-up I could explain away. Instead, I found myself sitting across from our HR director and a compliance officer I'd only met once during onboarding, both wearing those carefully neutral expressions people use when they're about to ruin your day. They had everything. Screenshots of booking confirmations showing my name and Adrian's name on the same hotel room. Invoices marked as complimentary per vendor contract. Even email attachments between Adrian and me that included things like, "Still know how to treat you," with winky face emojis. Someone had submitted it all through our anonymous corporate ethics portal, properly formatted, with documentation so thorough it looked like it had been prepared by a lawyer. They explained that I'd failed to disclose a personal relationship with someone connected to vendor accounts I had oversight on, a clear violation of our conflict of interest policies. The appearance of impropriety was itself a breach, regardless of whether anything illegal had occurred. I tried to explain that Adrian and I hadn't coordinated anything work-related, that the room was just... He stopped by. We didn't even think about the vendor connection. The compliance officer cut me off politely. "Miss Bradford, we're not accusing you of illegality. We're assessing exposure, liability, vendor integrity, and ethics violations. This is procedural." Procedural. That word became the soundtrack to my downfall. They reassigned me immediately, pulled me off all client-facing work, suspended my vendor access, and moved me to a back-office position while they completed their internal review. Within days, the entire office knew something was wrong. Coworkers who'd been friendly for years suddenly couldn't make eye contact. Conversations stopped when I entered break rooms. Someone whispered behind their hand while I walked past. I'd become radioactive, untouchable, a cautionary tale whispered about in the kitchen. I tried calling Benjamin to ask if he'd somehow done this, if he'd been the one to submit that complaint. His phone went straight to voicemail, and when I left messages, I got nothing back. I sent texts that showed delivered but were never read, or at least never acknowledged. It was like screaming into a void. I asked his former assistant, this sweet woman named Jennifer who'd always been friendly to me, if she knew where Benjamin was staying. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then mentioned something about him being in Colorado for meetings. Something about Evergreen holdings and escrow processes and compliance meetings. The name Evergreen sounded familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. Then it clicked. Evergreen was the LLC name on the paperwork for that mountain condo in Aspen. the beautiful place Benjamin had helped me find and decorate about 2 years earlier. I'd always called it my getaway place, my little retreat. I'd shown it off to friends, posted pictures of it on social media, taken Adrian there for a long weekend last winter when I told Benjamin I was at a conference. I'd thought of it as mine. I called the property management company in Aspen, trying to keep my voice steady. When I explained I was calling about my unit, there was this long, uncomfortable pause. Then the property manager, speaking very carefully like she'd been coached on exactly what to say, told me she wasn't authorized to share information with me. Evergreen Holdings was listed as the primary contact, and they'd been instructed to route all communication through legal counsel. I insisted that I was the owner, that it was my property, my name should be on everything. Another pause. Then she explained, with this gentle but firm tone, that I was listed in their system as a non-controlling member. The only person with actual authority over the property was Benjamin Carlisle. She couldn't discuss anything further without his authorization, and he'd specifically requested that I not be given information. I hung up feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. I tore through old emails, desperately searching for anything with Evergreen and my name on it. I found forwarded documents from Benjamin, stuff he'd sent months ago with boring subject lines like, "Need your signature for tax reasons," or "LLC papers the accountant needs." I remembered those mornings. Benjamin would slide papers across the breakfast table while I scrolled through Instagram or Pinterest, barely glancing at what I was signing. "Initial here, sign there," he'd say casually, and I'd scribble my name while planning trips with Adrian or shopping for furniture for the Vireo apartment. I never read what I was signing because I thought financial management was Benjamin's job, his boring hobby that didn't concern me. The condo I thought was mine wasn't mine at all. Benjamin owned it. He'd always owned it. He'd just given me keys, let me decorate it, let me believe I had ownership, while the actual paperwork told a completely different story. He'd built the illusion perfectly, and I'd lived in it without question. About a week after Benjamin left, I went to pay for groceries and my card declined. I figured it was some fraud alert, tried another card, declined. I tried a third, same result. I drove home with my heart pounding and tried to log into our joint checking account, the one we'd maintained throughout our marriage, with over $120,000 in liquid assets. Access denied. My login credentials didn't work. I called the bank in full panic mode, and after being transferred through 3 different departments, I finally got someone who could explain what happened. The joint account ending in 3402 had been formally closed 6 days earlier with proper signatures from both account holders. The representative explained in that careful, sympathetic tone people use when they're delivering devastating news to someone they'll never have to face in person. I told her that was impossible, that I never signed anything authorizing account closure. There was a pause. Then she explained that they had scanned authorization forms on file with both signatures, dated March 11th, submitted in person at their Glenview branch location, March 11th. That was the Saturday Benjamin had asked me to come with him to some tax preparation office downtown. He'd said something about needing my signature on forms for deductions and retirement account updates. I'd gone reluctantly, annoyed at spending my Saturday morning on boring financial stuff, when I could have been sleeping in or meeting Adrian for brunch. Benjamin had put a folder in front of me at the office, pointed to highlighted signature lines, and I'd signed everything without reading while I browsed vacation ideas on my phone. I'd been planning another trip with Adrian at that exact moment, completely distracted, not caring what the papers said. I'd signed the account closure authorization myself. Benjamin had orchestrated the whole thing months before I even mentioned Adrian to his face, back when I thought I was being clever and discreet about the affair. The representative explained that the funds from that account had been legally transferred to other accounts, according to the signed authorization. Over $120,000 gone, moved to places I had no access to. All perfectly legal, all properly executed, all done with my own careless signature. Over the next week, I discovered more. Our 3 rental properties, investments we'd built over years, had been sold months earlier, sold to shell companies with names I didn't recognize, companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. When I dug into the corporate registrations, I found that Benjamin controlled all of them. He'd sold our properties to himself, essentially, restructuring everything so that I had 0 ownership stake. One property's mailing address was literally a storage unit in Nevada, and every single transaction had my signature on the transfer documents. Papers I'd signed while scrolling through social media or texting Adrian, papers Benjamin had casually mentioned were for tax purposes, or liability restructuring. The beach condo we'd spent weekends at, the place where I'd hosted friends and felt so proud, technically belonged to a trust where Benjamin was the controlling trustee, and I was just a beneficiary with no actual rights or authority. He'd let me believe it was ours, let me decorate and furnish it, let me make plans there. But the legal reality was that he controlled everything, and I controlled nothing. Then came the Vireo apartment crisis. I'd been living in this beautiful place in a luxury high-rise downtown, all marble lobby and expensive fixtures and a doorman who barely looked up when I walked through. It was my private escape, the place I'd meet Adrian, my space away from Benjamin and the suffocating silence of our house. I came home one afternoon after another awful day at work to find an eviction notice taped to the door. Bold red letters, eviction notice, non-payment of contractual obligations, unit to be vacated immediately. I ripped it off the door and used my key, but something was wrong. The deadbolt was engaged from inside. I banged on the door, confused and angry, and a man in a mover's uniform opened it partway. "You, Jessica?" he asked. I demanded to know what he was doing in my apartment. He shrugged. "We've been authorized to clear it out. Everything's already inventoried, shouldn't take long." I shoved past him, my heels clicking furiously on the hardwood, and found chaos inside. Boxes half-packed, my clothes stacked like garbage, my toiletries in plastic bags. The leasing agent was standing in the living room with a clipboard, wearing this expression of performative sympathy that made me want to scream. She explained that there had been a complication with the payment source. I insisted I'd paid 6 months in advance, that I'd wired the money personally, that I lived there and they couldn't just kick me out. She nodded sympathetically and explained that yes, the payment had come from an entity called Calix Holdings LLC. But that same entity had initiated a clawback on all prepaid funds retroactively last week. And because the lease was technically under their name, the building was legally required to process the refund and initiate vacancy procedures. I stared at her, not understanding. She explained more slowly, like talking to a child, that I'd countersigned the lease as an occupant, but the actual leaseholder of record was Calix Holdings, registered in Delaware. I'd never been the legal tenant, just a designated user. A guest with permission. Delaware. That was Benjamin's favorite state for registering companies. I used to joke about how his trust accounts had more addresses than we did. "Why Delaware?" I'd asked once, half interested. "Because it's quiet," he'd replied, "and no one asks questions." Now I understood. The apartment I'd used to meet Adrian, the space I thought was my private sanctuary, had always belonged to Benjamin. He'd paid for it, controlled it, let me live there, and waited. And the day I mentioned Adrian to his face, he'd pulled the rug out with one legal filing. The movers kept packing while I stood there in shock. The leasing agent gently suggested I take what I needed because the unit was entering reassignment status, and another party had already expressed interest. I left with one suitcase and nowhere to go, except back to the house I'd shared with Benjamin, which now felt like hostile territory. Monica showed up at my door a few nights later looking absolutely terrified. Her hands were shaking as she carried this thick manila folder, and I could tell immediately something was catastrophically wrong. She didn't wait for an invitation, just walked in and slammed the folder on my kitchen table. "You need to see what he's done," she said, her voice cracking. "Jessica, you think he just left. You think he's having some breakdown. He didn't leave. He dissolved you." I opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were printed documents, screenshots from what looked like secure administrative portals, legal filings with official stamps. Benjamin had systematically removed me from everything. Medical directives showing I was no longer his emergency contact or healthcare proxy. Estate planning documents where I'd been removed as a beneficiary from his trusts and retirement accounts. Insurance policies where my name had been deleted. Trust revocation forms. Emergency contact removal confirmations. Every single system where my name had appeared next to his, every legal connection we'd built over 10 years, had been quietly severed. I wasn't his wife in any system that mattered. I wasn't even a contact. Monica explained, her voice barely a whisper, that Benjamin had retained some boutique law firm in Boston that specialized in executive asset restructuring. They handled quiet divorces for wealthy people who wanted to untangle their lives without public scandals or messy court battles. Benjamin had filed paperwork with them months ago, maybe even before I'd said anything about Adrian. The firm was called something like Leonard Harper and Associates, one of those names that sounded expensive and discreet. He'd been preparing this exit strategy for months, building the structure of my removal, while I mocked him for being boring and passive. "He's not divorcing you without divorcing you," Monica said, staring at me with this look of horror. "He's just erasing you. Like you were a file to be archived. No scandal, no public mess, just delete." The worst part came when I was going through my phone one sleepless night, unable to stop obsessing over everything that had happened. I found an old voice memo I'd recorded about 8 months earlier, back when I'd had too much wine and thought I was being hilarious. The file was titled something stupid like LOL Benjamin Silent Treatment. I played it, and my own voice filled the dark room, slurred and mocking. I heard myself saying things like, maybe I'll just keep Adrian on the side. You'd barely notice. You're so busy organizing the freezer." Benjamin's voice in the background, quiet and exhausted. "You think that's funny?" Me, giggling. "You used to have a sense of humor, babe. Relax." Then Benjamin, flat and tired. "Do you want this marriage, or do you just like how it decorates your tax return?" More laughter from drunk me. "God, you're dramatic. Relax. I'm just playing." I stopped the recording and sat there in the darkness, feeling sick. What had seemed like a joke at the time now sounded like a confession, a weapon, something that could be played in a quiet courtroom and destroy any claim I might make about being a devoted wife who deserved half of everything. I checked the file metadata. It had automatically backed up to our shared cloud storage 8 months ago. I opened the cloud account with trembling fingers and checked the access logs. Benjamin had downloaded that recording 3 days after I'd mentioned Adrian to his face. He had evidence of me joking about infidelity, dismissing his concerns, mocking our marriage, all in my own voice with timestamps that couldn't be disputed. If I tried to claim alimony or asset retention, that recording would eviscerate me. I tried emailing Benjamin one desperate night around 2 a.m, slightly drunk and completely panicked. I wrote this long, rambling message about how we'd spent almost a decade building a life together, how we'd been partners, how I'd made mistakes, but didn't I deserve at least a conversation? I sent it and then spent the next 48 hours obsessively checking my inbox, refreshing every few minutes, like checking would somehow make him respond faster. When the response finally came, it wasn't from Benjamin. The email was from litigation@leonardharperlaw.com, subject line, closure. It was from an attorney named Benjamin O. Harper, Esquire, representing Mr. Benjamin Carlisle regarding all matters related to the dissolution of financial and legal ties with me. The message was formal, clinical, absolutely devastating. It requested that all further communication be directed to their office. Any personal contact might be interpreted as maltreatment and would be addressed accordingly. Attached was a comprehensive audit, 88 pages long, titled Complete Asset and Legal Dissolution Report. I opened the PDF with shaking hands. It was a meticulous breakdown of every single thing Benjamin and I had ever shared. Joint financial accounts, closed with dates and transaction records, shared real estate holdings, divested or reassigned, complete with deed transfers, LLC formations, and new ownership structures. Business partnerships, formally exited with signed separation agreements. Medical, legal, and insurance authorizations, all rescinded with dated paperwork and custodial signatures. Trusts and retirement accounts, partitioned or revoked with forms filed with appropriate institutions. Everything was documented with timestamps, account numbers, confirmation codes from banks and government offices. Not a single asset was in dispute. Not one detail was ambiguous. The report had been reviewed by independent auditors and filed with every relevant custodian. The email ended with one paragraph. This message serves as formal notification that Mr. Carlisle considers all personal and legal chapters with you closed. Thank you. The subject line wasn't divorce proceedings or separation notice, it was closure, like I was a completed project, a business file that had finally been resolved and archived. Benjamin hadn't ghosted me. He'd memorialized our relationship, documented its death with forensic precision, and filed me away under no further action required. I sat on my couch in the dark apartment I could barely afford, wrapped in Benjamin's old college hoodie, because it was the only thing left that still smelled like our old life. And I thought that was the end. That I'd hit rock bottom. I was catastrophically wrong. Monica came back about a week later looking like she'd witnessed something horrific. She was holding a newspaper, one of those local business journals, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She threw it on my coffee table without saying a word. The front page had a headline, Local Development Executive Donates $3.20 million property to Women's Legal Advocacy Center. There was a photo underneath showing a ribbon-cutting ceremony at some new facility downtown. Smiling people, local officials, women's rights advocates, and standing in the back, barely visible but definitely there, was Benjamin. Not smiling, not making a show of it, just present, composed. The article explained that the donation had been made possible through a unique legal structure involving an infidelity clause embedded in a private trust agreement. When certain behavioral conditions were violated, specifically those related to marital fidelity, the property automatically defaulted to charitable purposes. The article specifically mentioned that internal documents identified a Jessica Bradford as the party whose actions had activated the clause. My name was in print. Not as a donor, not as a philanthropist, but as the behavioral trigger, the reason the charity existed. Benjamin had built the entire legal structure so that if I cheated, this property would automatically transfer to an organization supporting women leaving difficult relationships. The lawyers quoted in the article called it a landmark case in private trust litigation, something that would be studied and referenced for years. Monica whispered, "He didn't just erase you. He used you. He used your betrayal as legal leverage to trigger a clause he'd probably written years ago. That building wasn't donated. It was forfeited because of what you did. And he named you. Your actions are literally carved into the foundation of that place." I'm sitting here now, months later, in a cramped studio apartment I can barely afford on the reduced income from a job I finally found after being fired from my finance position. My reputation in the industry is destroyed. I have no access to any of the assets Benjamin and I built together because I never bothered to understand what I was signing. Never thought financial details mattered. Never believed Benjamin would use my own carelessness against me. He never yelled at me, never made threats, never did anything dramatic or violent. He just quietly engineered my complete removal from his life with the same methodical precision he'd used to build everything else. And I watched it happen, mocking him the entire time, not realizing I was standing in a structure he'd already condemned. Monica had said it perfectly that night. This is architectural revenge, the kind you don't see until you realize you're standing in a house that's already been demolished. Benjamin had spent 30 years learning how to build things that don't fall down under pressure. He'd simply applied that same expertise to taking me apart. And I'd handed him every tool he needed, signed every document, provided every piece of evidence, all while laughing at him for being boring. You can't fight an opponent who treats revenge like a construction project. I learned that too late, way too late.